Hello everybody and welcome back to Military Aviation History. I'm of course your host Bismarck and I'm today joined by Victoria Taylor. She is a British historian, currently pursuing a doctoral degree looking at the relationship between National Socialism and the Luftwaffe. She obtained her Master of Research at the University of Hull, looking at the Dambuster Raid, and currently she's also the assistant editor on the military journal Balloons to Drones. She also recently actually received the RAF's Research Prize for her work on the Dambusters, and I invited her today onto the channel to talk a little bit about that fateful mission, sort of crack it open, go a little bit beyond popular memory, talk about the aspects that aren't really discussed nowadays that actually are quite important when it comes to that event, and hopefully we'll learn a couple of new things. So Victoria, welcome.
Thank you very much.
And the first thing really that I would ask, just to get everybody on the same page, what was the Dambuster Raid?
Well, the Dambuster Raid was really seen as an opportunity to strike at the heart of German industry during the Second World War. It took place between the 16th and 17th of May 1943, when 19 Lancasters from 617 Squadron based in Scampton, Lincolnshire, took off, equipped with Barnes Wallis's famous bouncing bomb, better known as Upkeep. And they took off and they targeted several dams in the Ruhr region of Germany, right in its heartland, because it was known as the Waffenschmiede des Reiches, so the armory of the Reich. And they managed to succeed in blasting open the Möhne and the Eder dams, and also damaging the Zorko as well.
Yeah. And this mission, of course, has quite, it's an important event, let's say, and it's also often referred to in sort of British popular memory and culture and so on. What are sort of some of the main facets where you see that reflected in British culture?
Everywhere.
Everywhere.
More or less. I tend to refer to it as the Dambusters motif.
Okay.
Because it just crops up so often in British culture. It comes up in places such as quite recently, the London 2012 Olympics. The theme actually played during the sequence with James Bond and the Queen.
So
couldn't get any more British.
The movie theme, was it?
Yes, from the Dambusters, from the 1955 Dambusters film, yes. It also crops up in sort of satirical cartoons. It comes up in, as you say, film and music, and it's one of those motifs that keeps coming around. It came around a lot during the Brexit campaign, for better or for worse, but it's one of those things that really, it's so recognisable, and there's so many different sort of mixtures of both the film and the raid that almost it's hard to distinguish between the two for some people. Yeah,
if it comes down to it and you look at the aerial aspect of World War II for Britain, it's probably Battle of Britain, and then the Dambusters, and then
Dunkirk.
Yeah. There we go. So those are the three
the holy trinity,
the holy trinity of British
war
memory.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is not often mentioned, and that kind of surprised me when I read your paper on the Dambusters Raid, is that early on, when this sort of mission was proposed, and Wallace also sort of proposed the Upkeep bomb, of course, that actually there was some opposition to it. Not everybody was on board, and it wasn't a done deal.
Well, I mean, I'm always quite surprised at people sort of thinking that it was absolutely bizarre to sort of have any sort of objection to Upkeep, because I think so many people are looking at the raid retrospectively. They're looking at the fact it was, to all intents and purposes, very successful. And I think it's as a result, and because of how fondly the Upkeep is remembered, I think it's very easy for people to sort of think like, well, how dare they try and interfere? But of course, you've got to bear in mind that 1943, the war was far from over, and to be diverting vital Lancasters to a secretive squadron that might not actually, successfully breach these seemingly impenetrable targets. I don't think it's quite such a mad thing for it to have not been for there to have been objection. But of course, it tends to be the case that they do overplay in British mythology the sort of obstacles that Wallace was against. I mean, of course, there was some resistance, particularly from Harris, who sort of said when they came in to see all the film trials and everything, they started saying, what the hell do you damn inventors want, and just being utterly confused and calling it trite beyond the wildest description. Right. But really, there were a lot of people in exactly the right places to put Wallace's proposals forward, and to give it the backing that it needed in order to be able to secure the secret squadron and to deliver his weapon.
And then when it, of course, happened, and sort of the RAF realized that it had been successful, squadrons came back. Not all of them, of course, we'll go into that as well. But one of the things that sort of happened as well is the British media, of course, picks it up. It's a big propaganda sort of event.
Understandably.
And there is, I wouldn't say there's a disagreement between the RAF and the British media, but the RAF wasn't fully convinced with some of the coverage.
No, sorry. Go.
No, it's just that British media went off on some tangent.
They went a bit
perhaps.
Crazy, basically. Yes, they did. I mean, they started going towards, with no basis, no real actual factual knowledge. Some of the newspapers started reporting that about 10,000 people had been killed. They started to say that, in Kassel, their only wish is that the war shall end and that there was rioting in Duisburg and all of these sort of alarmist rumours that, obviously the areas were devastated, but they weren't at that level of broken German morale that they thought they were. And also they sort of had issues with the having problems with over-exaggerating things and creating new stories, fabricating new inside scoops for each magazine and each newspaper that really didn't really ally properly, didn't really sort of line up with what the RAF was reporting.
Yeah. That's also, I mean, if you're a soldier, especially, on those missions, and you come back and then you see that the media is just fabricating something, and you've lost some of your mates. You've went on a mission that is, I mean, it was hard to pull off, and it's in some ways it's a miracle that it was pulled off in the way that it happened. And then suddenly that's not good enough, and the media just goes on this tangent. But that's how it is. But that kind of leads us into this sort of other element that we don't often talk about, is that it's the emotional toll and the human sort of suffering. On the first, now we'll look at the British side. We'll go into the German side as well. That isn't really talked about. So some of the pilots, of course, had, you pointed out so in your paper, sort of emotional distress from the mission. Can you sort of expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say distress, simply because, I mean, this is quite a controversial topic. Actually, recently I was discussing this with a fellow PhD colleague about sort of how far people how far Bomber Command pilots actually did reflect on what they did in terms of, for most it was literally a case of, this is our job, let's go in and do it. We're going to lose comrades, but we know that's part of the deal, that's part of the package. But there were elements of guilt that I think are not discussed quite so much in the general British narrative. So, for example, Les Munro said about the fact that he felt very guilty actually to be in the mess after the raid, because he had made the attack on the Zorpa Dam, which, I mean, I think it actually doesn't get enough credit. They had allocated a quarter of the force to destroy it, but they knew that there wasn't so much of a chance to destroy it because of the fact that it just wasn't susceptible to upkeep as the Moehne and the Eder were.
Why was that? So Moehne and Eder were what kind of sort of dams?
Well, they were gravity dams. The way that they were built, with being sort of brick and curved, they were more susceptible to the mine being underneath. Whereas with the Zorpa Dam, because it's an earth-based dam, you have the issue of they had to drop it on top of the parapet rather than at the bottom. So you kind of had the issue there that, as if it wasn't already difficult enough with the Moehne and the Eder, you already had the triangulation bomb site, so it's easier to spot the two towers on the Moehne, the one on the Eder, and then release the bomb. But of course you didn't really have that with the Zorpa, so it's just made even more difficult. But sorry, to go back to Munro, he felt because they didn't achieve, they did manage to damage it enough for it to be drained, but it wasn't the the visual spectacle that came with the moon and the Ada. There really was quite a lot of guilt from Monroe, because he didn't feel like he could really join in with the celebrations, because he thought, well, we haven't really achieved anything, and there's also aspects as well. I mean, with Gibson, he was very much, well, his father claimed he was very upset by the loss of animals, because he's a great animal lover. And also, I know, so I mean, that's a whole other thing to go to, like human lives, animals, and there's obviously been sort of a retrospective reflection as well. So from
music just started. Timing.
Okay. So there's been a reflection over time as well. So with George Johnny Johnson's probably the most obvious example, with the Last of the Dambusters documentary, where he was very much, absolutely. There is no doubt about this raid, it's military worthwhile. Anyone that questions any part of it is not worth bothering with. But he did find, after he went and he spoke to a survivor and he saw the community that was sort of surrounding the Zorka, he did feel quite guilty about the fact that if they had succeeded, that all of those people would have been drowned as well. So I do think there are some aspects of operational guilt that are in the Dambuster story, but they're not considered quite so much because it just doesn't conform with the historic narrative.
Well, as with everything, it's a complicated subject. And we humans are complicated beings, and we have different feelings about the same event sometimes. There was also, I think, something you mentioned some point with the WAF operators of 617 Squadron being rotated because they didn't, they essentially the day before the raid they saw everybody, and then only about half.
Well, 53 men were killed and captured.
And that just had, on the squadron and also the supporting structure of the squadron, that just had an immense sort of impact, because that percentage of losses was, I wouldn't say catastrophic, but if you compare it to the other bombing raids, of course, where they were conducted under completely different conditions, that casualty rate was just enormous. But then, starting to go sort of in the casualties that were sort of caused by the attack, there was a prisoner of war camp in the area, and there were labor camps that the Germans had. Of course, their production, the aim part of this mission was, of course, to knock out production and the infrastructure. And the casualties were not just German civilians or soldiers, rather, but prisoners of war and people in the labor camps.
In Britain itself, one of the first things that the newspapers reported about the Déluge was, there's no British prisoners of war, so it's okay, there's no problem, which is awful considering, you had the Poles and the French and the Ukrainians on their side. But it's sort of, again, it's another aspect that it's almost twisted a little bit in terms of it being sort of, well, they wouldn't be there if it weren't for the Germans, so it's sort of twisted a little bit that it's not really our fault, even though, it's 617 Squadron that were involved in the operation that caused that. But, we can't lose sight of it being collateral damage, that they weren't the German civilians weren't the main aim. I mean, that's not to say that they weren't, that they thought about the fact that it's not only dislocating transportation systems and swamping factories, but that it will affect factory workers as well. It wasn't a thing. They weren't blind to that. They knew that people would get caught up in the chaos, basically. But a lot less is said about the prisoners of war and the labourers, because, again, it's an uncomfortable part of the narrative. It doesn't fit in. Even though really some of the testimonies that they have over it are truly horrific.
Did the British or the RAF know about the labour camps and the prisoner of war?
No.
Because it is hard to differentiate. And now in retrospect we can say, it should be easy. That's a labour camp, that's a prisoner of war camp, that's a factory. But in reality you have aerial photography. And you don't really have, well, sometimes you have people on the ground telling you some things. But really, differentiating between these different camps, especially because they often look so similar, or they're tied into each other.
Absolutely.
That it's really hard to say. Shifting now over to the German side, did Germany ever have an idea about attacking dams in Britain?
They did, yes, which is what sort of made a sort of an unforeseen consequence of the Dams raid, potentially very dangerous, which again is not really discussed because it's not part of the heroic narrative. They looked into blowing up some of the dams near Sheffield, so Howden and Derwent, which of course would have been absolutely catastrophic for the British war effort because of how much steel was produced in Sheffield. And they had looked into, I think it was a plan from 1942, they'd looked into, I think, part of the Obernach program, I think, which basically looked to blowing them up with TNT.
Okay.
So yes, the Germans had considered it, not in the same depth, not in the same detail as the British had. I mean, contrary to popular belief, people seem to think that the Dams raid originated just with Barnes Wallis alone, that he was the one that thought, oh, you know what, we're going to attack the Möhne and the Ede and the Zorka. But, I mean, attacking the dams of the Ruhr had been in British minds since about October 1937.
Okay.
So it'd been in the process for quite a while. But in Germany, they did think of it, and they did conduct trials, but it wasn't in the same sort of seriousness.
It's interesting that they were kind of thinking about the same thing at the same time, and then just the British went for it. The Germans didn't, and here we are. But one of the things is, of course, that which plane was it? E for Easy that crashed during the Dambuster Raid, and the Germans actually retrieved a more or less intact upkeep bomb. They interviewed, or well, I guess interrogated. Interrogated.
Well, it's a slightly soft word for interrogate.
They interrogated one of the prisoners of war that they got out. Was he actually from E for Easy? Did he get out, or was he from a different?
No, he was from John Hoppy Hobgood's plane, which I can't think of the designation right now. He was the pilot that died, so because he was the pilot that was holding the Lancaster long enough for Bircher and Fraser to escape.
To get out.
Yeah.
So Fraser got picked up by the Germans, interrogated, and he actually we both saw this file in the archives. The RAF, of course, after the war retrieved the interrogation file, and you see sort of what information was given by Fraser, and relatively to the point information, to the point where the Germans learned how many revolutions, how many was it again? 500 revolutions per minute the bomb had to spin in order to actually have that bouncing effect. The one thing that Fraser didn't tell them, which was crucial, was that the bomb had to be spun backwards. The Germans were, of course, well, we're launching the bomb that way, so we're spinning it that way. And
I mean, they'd even been told by Fraser that they knew exactly which height to fly, so they knew to fly at 60 feet. They knew that it had to be that the upkeep bomb had to start spinning, quite a few minutes before going in for attack, and how many revolutions per minute. But yes, he left that bit out. Well done, Fraser.
And the Germans are just, why does this not work? And out-engineered once again. But having already talked a little bit about British propaganda, what was the German reaction, the official reaction, and sort of going forward and trying to deal with this on a public relations standpoint?
It was very much... It was a reflection of how much it scared the Nazi leadership, in that they felt that they had to be honest with the numbers that they reported in the newspapers, but also that they had to be entirely uniform. There was a very set way that the reports were given, which was literally just a few sort of tiny paragraphs that appeared in the local newspapers. But they did appear because of Goebbels' fear in the local areas that such alarmist rumours might spread. So it was kept undercover quite well, and it does sort of still fit the narrative that a lot of German historians call it a geheime Katastrophe, so a secret catastrophe. But it did really strike at fear into the leadership's heart. So Hitler called it that disaster in the West, and Arbeitsstab said about how it made a deep impression on the Führer. So of course they did have to be very careful in what they reported. So
it's a bit interesting because I get sort of the impression that the leadership was very concerned and shocked, whereas the local people, yes, they were scared as well. But since if you live in Hamburg or in any big city, you had your own problems to worry about now, since obviously the daylight and nighttime bombing campaign was starting to escalate. So that's kind of an interesting contrast. And I should also mention that, I have mentioned this before, Victoria actually learned German, and she went also to the archives and looked at the original German source material, so she knows what she's talking about.
Trust me.
It is instant. Talking then about sort of the casualties, I know there is a sort of debate on the numbers, and it's obviously very hard to give an accurate one, but there's sort of this accepted interval of how many people actually sort of suffered by this attack, from anybody from a prisoner of war to a labor worker to somebody who was living in the area. But that also sort of, I guess, goes to show that how difficult it really was to assess what the actual damage was of this attack. We do have, I think, an estimate of sort of the fact how many factors were knocked out, heavily damaged. I think there's also a German report on this that we saw in the archives. How was sort of the damage on the British side? How was it assessed themselves? Like, did they look at it? Did they fly recon planes over? Did they have any kind of post-attack assessment?
Yes, well, I mean, obviously, they had a lot of reconnaissance images that were circulated in the newspapers literally as soon as they could get them out, because it was such a visual representation of smashing at the heart of German industry, and they could easily replicate such images because they were so stark and so clear that you would just see this, the deluge completely running through sort of local areas and cities. So they did soon assess it that way. The civilians, in terms of the deaths, the 10,000 dead and that sort of thing, really that came from nowhere. That was absolutely just, completely hyped up British wartime propaganda. So it's sort of quite difficult. They've looked more at what was damaged, sort of like in the post-war period with historians, and a lot of people sort of point towards really sort of more tangible ways of showing the disruption it caused. So for the fact that they had to drain the Sorpe, or that they had to move over certain Organisation sort of labourers away from the Atlantic Wall, which of course, I mean, some people say that Dambusters shortened the war in that respect, and that they took away manpower from there. I think it's a little bit of a step, but it's still a contribution overall. But really, it was more done in the case of being, measuring it in things that were much more visual and easier to relay, rather than to the specific details. I mean, reports do exist, but of course, in wartime Germany, it's hard to gain that sort of information on the British side.
So sort of coming full circle now, we've looked at the German side, we've looked at the British side. We're now obviously in the post-war period, luckily. How is sort of, we have already also talked sort of how it's remembered here in the UK, but it might be interesting for viewers, how is it remembered in Germany? Because obviously that country experienced other shocks during the war that had to do with bombing campaigns. And obviously, as a German, I know that for most people that I know, some haven't even heard about the Dambuster Raid. Whereas maybe locally it's more commemorated.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I suppose in that way it still is a bit of a geheime Katastrophe, in that the rest of Germany still doesn't really know about the Dambusters, unless it's all the Brits flocking to the Moehnetalsperre to come look at it, But it's one of those things that it's remembered more in the local areas, because I think it's the sort of thing that they don't really want to remember, because it was so brutal, I suppose, the impact. I mean, it's easy for these things to be eclipsed by the firestorms at Dresden and Hamburg, but I think some of it is because it's in the local areas, because you still have quite a lot of eyewitnesses that were very young, so a lot of them are actually still alive, and as a result, there has been sort of like a trickle of testimonies coming out, but they're not often widely shared. Like you'll normally find them in local newspapers at sort of commemoration events rather than being wider. But there are a few exceptions. There's some interesting exceptions. So, for example, Karl Schulte, he wrote an article for Die Zeit, which was from about 1993 or something like that, and he wrote about the impact of being in one of the local, I think it was near Essen, I think, and he wrote about the impact, and it really went into unprecedented detail of really just how horrific it was. So they had, sort of animal bodies in the water, and there was people being completely and utterly, mangled and having to be like straightened back out again to be buried, and just really, truly horrific sort of moments that don't really match with the Dambusters legend, which are not really looked at. I mean, it's the sort of thing we can't lose sight of the fact that it wasn't an intended side effect. It wasn't like the Dambusters' fault, they were just doing their job, but it's still a completely valid part of the narrative that needs to be examined to show that you can't just glorify war, because there's costs to both sides. So. And
the interesting aspect is that locally they actually crowdfunded a memorial for the crashed bomber, where they actually found the Abschied bomb in E4EZ, which was crowdfunded locally in Germany for a British bomber crew, British bomber, and sort of the attack. Germany and the UK is now, I think they are commemorating the attack together. Hopefully wishing that something like this never happens again. But sort of coming to a conclusion here, I guess I'll just pass it up once again to Vicky, sort of to have the last words, the final words. Before I do that, however, I do want to address the fact that, yes, this is not a Lancaster.
Yes, please.
It is a Halifax.
We are aware of the difference.
But I do want to thank the Yorkshire Air Museum here that we're filming on their premises for allowing us to do this. And it is a great museum. You definitely should check it out. And obviously we have also an episode on the Halifax. And eventually we will get a Lancaster on the channel as well. Hopefully. But Vicky, if you have anything, final words to say?
I think, well, from my perspective, I feel like the Dams Raid, for me, was military worthwhile. I think that it was entirely legitimate, but I also think that all aspects of it are legitimate, that we should look at the suffering at all sides and all the different aspects of it, because then we lose sight of, particularly in Britain, this great time of the war, and you've got to bear in mind, but to do that, to achieve that raid, children had to be drowned, pilots had to be traumatized. It's one of those things that I feel like we sometimes drift into, away from admiration to celebration, particularly with sort of, at football grounds sort of singing the Dambusters theme and things like that. And, it's a question of personal taste. But I personally felt like the Dams Raid should be admired, because it was a fantastic raid. In terms of, the difficulties of flying at 60 feet and in enemy territory at night, and with Lancasters that really didn't have the airframes that could cope with that. The bravery of those men, it's just insane. But I do feel like we should move more towards admiration and not celebration.
All right. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that little talk. You learned something. If you did, please do tell us. And if you have anything else to add, let us know. Please also check out our Patreon. It is your support there that actually allows us to, come to airfields, museums like this, and do this kind of content. Share the video as well if you enjoyed it. And as always, I wish you guys a great day, good hunting, and see you in the sky.